The midlife crisis. Is this a real thing?
Yeah, absolutely. It is well known that stress is the peaks in your midlife and happiness goes down in your midlife. Suicide, for example, peaks, especially for male in midlife. Definitely like something that we should think of and notice. And we don't really know for sure why it happens. But one thing that happens in midlife is that you have a lot of stressors coming your way. So we're talking about 40s and 50s. So you have little kids that you need to take care of. Maybe you have elderly parents that you're worried about. Professional life has a lot of stressors in midlife. So that's really a time where we see the midlife crisis. But one thing that we think is that perhaps this is also a time that you're not progressing as much, right? So kind of in your 20s and so on, you learn a lot, you gain skills, you get to perhaps a good position, and then it's sort of plateauing, right? For a lot of people, it can kind of plateau in midlife. Perhaps they have a good job, right? But they're kind of stuck. They're not really moving as much. They're not learning as much. Less variety, right? Things are a little bit more routine. And that could be one reason why happiness is relatively low in midlife. It's also hard to see like what is next sometimes, right? While you're climbing up, you're kind of, well, this is my goal. But once you get there, it's a little bit disappointing to some extent, even if you've done really well, right? Because as we talked about before, one thing that is really important for our happiness is kind of us believing that we have something to gain, something to go forward to. Now, why does then happiness go back up after midlife, right? So we don't know, but here's one speculation that at a certain point in time, maybe you're retiring, then actually life changes again, right? In an odd way, there can actually be more variety and change and learning. You need to learn how to live life again with this new context of not going to work every day, and you might make decisions, all sorts of decisions of what to do with your time, which will require you to learn again.
When you get to sort of say 40, 50 years old, you're probably in a relationship.
Which you've been in for a while.
So
Yeah.
there's not that pursuit. Your job, your career, your profession, your identity, your geography, your house, friendship circles are probably all well established at that point. And your hypothesis is that the lack of forward motion and the abundance of routine means that you lose something in life.
Yeah. So things are less new, right?
New.
It's kind of same. Imagine the best day of your life. You wake up in the morning and you eat like the best breakfast that you can think of, right? And then you interact with the people that you love the most and you go do the best activity, like what you want, and you see your favorite movie. So the whole day is your favorite things. Really great. And then you wake up the next day and you do the same. And then you wake up the next day and you do the same, right? A few weeks in, the best day of your life just doesn't elicit as much joy, right? And also, there's nothing to learn anymore. So even if you're living your absolute best life, if it is the same again and again and again and again, it will eventually be a little bit even depressing, I would say.
So that's, by definition, not our best life.
Right. So then it is, what is our best life? So I think when people think about what my best life is, what they're thinking about is, oh, I want that great house, right? I want that great partner. I want money and then you can get all of these things, but if they remain constant, that's just not going to be your best life. And you can engineer this. I mean, even if it's like midlife and everything is set and you're in one house and so on, for example, you can go take a course, learn something new, right? A new field that is not your own. You can go a new sport, right? There's things that you could do, go visit places that you haven't been, try to make connections with people that are a bit different from your regular crowd that you're interacting with. It's a little bit hard to do because it's going to require effort. The easiest thing to do is just continue. Same.
We assume
right?
that happiness will be derived from us. I almost don't know how to say this, like from us being on autopilot. Like if we do what society said, you work a job, you get a partner, you create a house, we assume that will lead to happiness. But what you're saying is the research shows that we actually need to keep almost dismantling or disrupting our own experience to find happiness or to be happy. I guess we can't find happiness, we be happy.
Yeah, did a whole bunch of surveys to figure out what are the factors that are most associated with people's happiness. And the number one was meaning, right? People who could say, I have meaning in my life, that was number one. Number two was control. People who felt they have control over their life. And I don't remember what number income was, but it wasn't especially high. Oh, I think social connections was really high as well, right? So a lot of these things were these psychological things, not necessarily material things that really induced people's happiness and satisfaction from their life.
Somewhat linked to that, studies show that after getting married, people report to being happier on average. Yet about 2 years after their honeymoon period, happiness levels tend to be the same as their pre-marriage levels.
Yeah, so this is a well-known, what's called the hedonic treadmill.
Oh, yeah.
So the hedonic treadmill means that we sort of have a baseline level of happiness, which is determined, a lot is genetic. It might be determined by early childhood experiences. And we can move from that baseline. We can go up if something good happens. Maybe you have a good relationship, marriage, you get a promotion. It can go down if something bad happens, even bereavement. But it turns out that in most cases, you climb back to your baseline level of happiness. So these things, they can go up and they can down, and then you kind of adapt, right? You end up trying, and this goes back to this idea that we're trying to get all these things. We think, oh, once I get this promotion, then I'll be really happy. And then you get the promotion and it's great. But then after a while, you just go back to your baseline. Now, on one hand, this actually is not a bad thing, because imagine you get your first entry-level job and people are really happy with their first entry-level job. Great. But imagine I just continue being really happy with my first entry-level job, right? I won't be motivated to move forward, right? Mm-hmm. So this is why habituation is there, because it's moving us forward as an individual and as a society. On the other hand, it also reduces our joy. And it also sometimes causes us not to see some of the bad things around us because we habituate to that as well. Another reason why habituation is important is for your mental health. Right. And that's kind of related to what we just talked about, where bad things happen and slowly we adapt and we go back to baseline. We are able to recover. Right. It's kind of our superpower, our immense ability to just bounce back for most individuals. And what's interesting is that you actually see that people with depression, they habituate much slower. So there's a great study that was conducted in the University of Florida by a Professor Aaron Heller, where he had students who just got exam results, and he asked them how they were feeling. And then he asked them how they were feeling after every 45 minutes for the whole day. And what he found is when people got bad results, they were feeling bad, right? They're not happy. And that's true for people who never had depression episodes in their life and people who were experiencing depression or had depression before. So everyone was feeling bad at the beginning. Those people who did not have any history of depression, they slowly started feeling better from this bad grade. Those with depression also started feeling better, but much slower, right? So in other words, depression is related to slower habituation, slower recovery from negative events in your life. And one reason we think this is because depression is related to going over these bad events in your mind again and again, not letting go, right? You're kind of like chewing over them again and again and again. And that is something that is preventing you from recovering and bouncing back from these aversive events.
If habituation causes us to lose the joy of our current situation, then how come, as you say in chapter 2, the chapter about variety, you say that up to 40% of employees resign within the first 6 months of their new job? You'd think their new job would bring them joy because it was different. But up to 40% of employees resign within the first 6 months.
So new things can bring us joy because they're different.
Yeah.
However, at the same time, and this kind of goes back to the vacation example that I gave you, which was people are not the happiest when they just get to the resort. It takes them time, right? It takes them 43 hours to get to the peak joy. Why? Because they still need the time to adapt, right? They need to unpack. They need to get used to this new routine. Same thing with a new job, for example. So on one hand, getting a new job, you're going to learn things, and that's great, and eventually it will get you joy. But when you're there for the first day or the first few days, there's a lot of getting used to things around you, right? You need to like figure who's who, right? Who's on top, who's in the bottom, like where is the cafeteria? What am I going to eat? There's so many different things that you need to figure out. It can be stressful, it can be overwhelming, and you often want to just like run back to your old life. Run back to your new job and do a U-turn. And the problem is that often people don't predict this. They can't see ahead, right? They think it's like, well, I'm unhappy with my new job on my first day or my second day or even the first week. That means that this is not a good job for me. Perhaps it's not a good job for you, or perhaps you just need to allow it some time to adapt. So, my recommendation is whatever it is that you're trying that's new, it can also be something like a new relationship, right? Give it some time because you're going to have to get used to the things that are also not great. You will also get used to things that are great, but you have to get used to those things that are not great. And then after a while, you won't see them anymore, right? So not going to affect you as much. So give it time. Now, if you gave it time and still you're unhappy, sure. Yeah, make a change.
There's a clear message in here for managers, employees, CEOs, founders about how to keep their team motivated and engaged. And the message that I'm hearing is the importance in creating variety in their work. Because I always think in businesses I'm involved in, if someone's doing the same thing for like 12 months, we're going to have to have a conversation within the next 3 months, because they will typically come to me and say like, something's not right. And it's typically that people need a bit of variety in their work, I guess, because that gives it a little kick of meaning again. I think I've always hypothesized that people need like 5 things to really like their jobs. Number 1 is a sense of forward motion towards a goal. So that's progress, I guess. Feeling like you're making forward motion. Number 2, challenge. They need to be like sufficiently challenged. Not too challenged, because then there's lots of issues. Under challenged, lots of issues, lose motivation, like in game psychology. Number 3 is control and autonomy. So feeling like you've got control over your life, your work. Number 4 is meaning in the work you're doing, subjective meaning. Jack's reason for doing this podcast will be entirely different from someone else in the team, for example. And then the last one is working in like a supportive group of people.
There's a lot of studies about this, that you want a situation where you're learning something, because if you're learning nothing, people are not engaged, right? But if it's like so difficult that you can't learn, right? People are unhappy as well. So you have to be like in the spot in the middle, right? That's a sweet spot. And again, it's different for everyone, right? Where it's not too easy, but it's not too difficult. So you have something to learn, but you're still progressing. And that's very important. There's a great study showing that if you put people in a room and there's absolutely nothing for them to do except to shock themselves, they will shock themselves. Like little shock. I don't mean, this paper was actually in Science a few years ago. So meaning that boredom can be so aversive to people, they would actually prefer physical pain than to just not do anything at all. So that's on the one hand. And then of course on the other hand is when you're sitting in a class or you're listening to a lecture and you have no idea it's too much, right? Because you haven't gotten there. Maybe you'll take the steps, eventually you'll get there. But you started off by saying for employees, you need to kind of change, right? Give them different projects and so on. And what's interesting, not only will they enjoy it more, they're more likely to get to creative solutions. Start with the fact that what has been found is that people who habituate slower are more creative. So there's different ways to measure how fast you habituate. What they did in this study is that they had a sound, the same sound again and again and again, and they measured conductance, which shows, so it is how aroused you are. When you're aroused, you sweat more.
Okay.
And that is measured by the skin conductance, right? And so when there's like a sound, there's a response. So if a sound is the same sound again and again and again, most people habituate. There's no longer response, long skin conductance. But for some people, they continue responding, right? Because they're not habituating. And what was found is those people who continue responding, those were the people who already showed creativity in their life. They had a patent under their name. They had an exhibition in an art gallery. They had a book that they wrote. They had got prizes for innovative work. And the question is, why is that? And I think the reason is that because of habituation, we filter a lot of information, right? And it makes sense. Information is not important. But if you don't habituate, you're going to have a lot of bits of information in your mind simmering. Objects, sounds, bits and pieces of knowledge that are not important on their own, but they're just going to stay in your mind. They're going to simmer. And once in a while, they will create something new. Mm-hmm. And that's where innovation comes in. And really, if you think about the most creative solutions that people come up with, it's usually they take something from one field, something really boring, unimportant, mundane, and that bit of mundane piece of information then solves a problem in this other completely different field. And or there's like this part of knowledge here that is boring and this other part of knowledge in this other field that also seems very mundane, but you put them together and suddenly you create something that is really, really interesting and creative, right? I mean, often you see, for example, people taking what they know from biology, which, on its own doesn't seem so important, but then they take that and they use it to solve a problem in a different field, technology, for example, right? That is like the most creative solutions. So how do we facilitate that? How do we facilitate dishabituation in order to enhance creativity? And the answer is changing your environment. And it could be simple things. There's studies showing that if you just change your environment, let's say you're working in the office for a few hours and you go work in a coffee shop for a few hours, right? That change can actually also enhance creativity. You're sitting and working and then you're going out and walking or going out for a run. Studies show for the first 6 minutes, you're going to be more creative, and also vice versa. So if you were out walking, out running, and then you come back and you sit in your office, for the next 6 minutes, you're going to be more creative. Now, 6 minutes may sound like that's not a lot of time, but sometimes it's just enough for you to get the aha moment. I can remember those instances where I came up with an idea that would then change my course of research for a long time. Those ideas that were really important. So if I think about these examples, like one example was I was in the office trying to solve this problem and I couldn't find a solution, so I decided to go to the gym. And then, so I walked to the gym, and then while I was getting to the gym, that's when, the solution came about. Mm-hmm. And I remember like calling my student and like sharing that, and that would then change years of what we were going to do, right? So just all I did was changed my physical activity, changed just my physical surrounding. And that's exactly what these studies show. Or another example was, again, I was in my office and I took a break. And I was reading the New York Times science section. So not hugely different, but still different, right? And then I read something about monkeys, and I do humans. And that, again, an idea came about by taking a break and doing something that was a little bit different. And I think every single example of this, it's always like that. It's never me trying to think of something new, me trying to find a solution. It's always doing something else, which then something unusual, not something that I do like 90% of the time in a day. And that doing those times is when these kind of new ideas came about.
The brain generally, having spent so much time studying it, what are the fundamental surprises you've come to learn about humans that you think most people just don't understand or agree with? Like the things that we don't want to believe about ourselves that are unfortunately true.
Things that are unfortunately true.
I see this,
right.
I read this throughout your work, things where you go, humans wouldn't say they're like that if you ask them, but clearly they are because of the research.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it is true that we're not conscious of most of these kind of systematic mistakes that we make and the biases that we have. For example, I mean, maybe our belief system is a great example. of why we believe what we believe, I think that if you'd ask people, why do you believe a certain thing, they would probably give you some kind of rational explanation, right? I believe this thing because, here's all the evidence and so forth. But in fact, most of the times, the reason we believe something is that we were brought up in an environment where that belief was a popular one, or people around us believe it, or we've heard it again and again. One interesting thing is, this is a huge effect where people are not aware of it. As long as you hear something repeatedly, even twice, the likelihood that you believe it goes way up versus something that you hear once. It's called the illusory truth effect. There's so many studies showing this. You tell people something twice, they don't remember that they've heard it twice. And they're going to believe it way more than something that they just heard once. The reason for this is that the brain processes information that it's heard before less, right? Okay, so let's say I tell you that a shrimp's heart is in its head, right? So when you hear that sounds really surprising, and your brain takes a lot of resources to process this. You might think about the last time I ate a shrimp, right? Or just imagine the shrimp's heart is in his head. But the second time I'm going to tell you this, a shrimp's heart is in his head, your brain's not going to process this as much, right? And the third time, it's not going to process it at all. Now, when your brain takes less effort in processing things, that causes a signal of familiarity. And as a result, we're more likely to believe something. When something requires less effort and less energy to process, we believe it more. So anything that you hear again and again and again, as you hear it more and more and more, it takes less energy to process. And if it takes less energy to process, our brain then concludes that is likely true. And for good reason, because most of the time when you hear something again and again and again, most of the time it's true. So if you heard something from, your aunt, and then you heard it from your friend, and then you heard it from your doctor, why do all the people tell you all these things? Because on average, it's true. But sometimes it's not going to be true, right? It's going to be false beliefs.
If you love the Diary of a CEO brand and you watch this channel, please do me a huge favor. Become part of the 15% of the viewers on this channel that have hit the subscribe button. It helps us tremendously, and the bigger the channel gets, the bigger the guests.